most hotly contested conversational points in all of the Naruto fandom is just how powerful was EMS Madara. We're not talking about the Madara who fought in the 4th Great Shinobi World War, not Edo Tensei Madara, not freshly reborn, Rini Rebirth Madara, and definitely not Jubidara. No, how strong was EMS Madara, the one that had to fight against Hashirama a couple dozen times? And honestly, it's hard to say because everything and everybody from that era existed in this upper echelon of power that made everyone's power feel relatively equal. And while we can conceptualize how powerful people like Hashirama and Madara were at the peak of their powers, the peak of their power, especially in the case of Madara, is sometimes tied into things that they didn't always have. Take, for example, Madara with Kurama. And thus EMS Madara is a character that pops up all the time in hypothetical versus battles. Who would win in a fight between EMS Madara and Sakura? Who would win in a fight between Shin Uchiha and Madara? But I don't think anybody's ever really nailed down the perfect versus battle for an alive EMS wielding Madara. That is, of course, until now. Because I don't believe that EMS Madara scales to Sakura, and as controversial as his opinion might be, I don't even think he scales to Shin Uchiha. But then, to where does he scale? Well, according to somebody in my emails who's been having this ongoing conversation with their brother for 5 years now, the answer lies with Kisame. But is this a valid claim? Is a battle between Kisame and Madara even worth considering? Because even as I say it right now, you're probably thinking to yourself, Madara destroys Kisame, right? Well, maybe not. See, because Kisame is an interesting hypothetical battle for an alive EMS-wielding Madara, on account of the fact that in a way he represents the logical progression of the brother of Madara's mortal enemy in Tobirama. Because in the grand power-scaling universe of Naruto, many would say that if there is one water-style user better than Tobirama, it's Kisame. And therefore, as you begin to unpack this hypothetical battle between two people who are technically aligned in the Eye of the Moon plan, you start to see how a battle between the two of them actually makes a fair amount of sense. And thus today, we're digging till we get to the bottom of it, because today, we're talking, could Kisame beat EMS Madara? But before we get to talking about this hypothetical beatdown between a fish and a dead guy, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you guys are looking for one additional NC Hammer 23 video every single week, you can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the 4th wall link in my description below. There are 70 episodes in there, and I could not be excited for more of you to get to watch them. But before we get into all that, I want to talk to you about the sponsor of today's episode, BetterHelp. For those of you who don't know, I actually deal with a lot of stress and anxiety personally, especially when it comes to social endeavors, which is tough on account of the fact that I'm a massive extrovert. And for years, I found myself pushing myself to be the center of attention at parties because I love doing that, and then worrying about whether or not I was doing too much at parties. And slowly but surely, that fear about how I was doing at parties bled into fears about how I was doing in light social gatherings, and then one-on-one, until eventually I found myself purposely isolating myself so I didn't have to deal with these fears. But fortunately, that's where BetterHelp came into my life. See, BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. All I had to do was take a quiz, and after a couple of pretty easy questions, I was matched with a therapist perfect for my needs. And whether I wanted to communicate over phone, text, or video call, all of those options were afforded to me, giving me not only unprecedented access to my therapist, but also ensuring that I was able to receive my therapy in whatever way I was comfortable with that day. However, in the hypothetical circumstance where the therapist I was connected with did not work out, swapping therapists on BetterHelp is not only easy, but also free, which is why undoubtedly already 6 million people have already found help on BetterHelp. So what are you waiting for? Head to the link on screen or in my description to get 10% off your first month of therapy with BetterHelp. Before we dive into this video, guys, I'd like to point out this is the last video we are filming in this studio. I am in the process of moving, and while I'm not moving all that far, and the studio is probably going to look relatively similar where I do end up going to, we've spent 2.5 years in this studio right here, and this is how we're wrapping it up. So to those of you who've been here for all 2.5 years, and to those of you who have seen me go through 2 other studios before this, thank you so much for being here for so long. It means the world to me. The next studio we go to is gonna be our last one, because I'm moving into a house that I bought with the money that I've made from YouTube. So without you guys, none of these studios ever would have been possible. So before we dive into this fight, let's establish who we're talking about. Obviously on the side of Kisame, we're talking about a full-powered Kisame who has access to Samehada. And we're assuming over the course of this fight that Samehada doesn't fall in love with Madara's chakra and decide to switch sides. Now on Madara's side of the equation here, we're talking about EMS Madara. So no Rinnegan, no Edo Tensei, no infinite chakra, no infinite regeneration, no Hashirama cells, and maybe more importantly than anything, no Kurama. Yes, I understand that it was EMS EMS Madara, who went out into the wilds and put Kurama under Genjutsu and rode him into battle against Hashirama, but we're not going to say that he does that for a battle against Kisame. But we're still talking about a prime, alive Madara who, on a whim, could fly off to the village hidden in the stone to subjugate the Tsuchikage and say, you guys should exist under us. We're talking about a man who went head-to-head with Hashirama in his prime dozens of times and tied him every single time. A man who, while he did lose to both Tobirama and Hashirama simultaneously, was able to enter into that fight in the first place. But how strong is EMS Madara? Well, it's a tough question to answer. See, because if we talked about EMS Madara's most prolific and well-documented fight, that would be his final battle against Hashirama. However, it's hard to separate Madara's strength from Kurama's strength in this fight. Yes, obviously we have to understand that in order to subjugate Kurama and clad him with the Susanoo, that Madara in some kind of way has to be stronger than Kurama. However, even going forward, this line of logic is kind of difficult because we've been shown that Kurama is seemingly rather easy to control with Genjutsu. Not only was Madara able to control Kurama with Genjutsu, but so was Obito at 14 years old. And moreover than this, it's kind of implied that really anybody with the Sharingan is able to control Kurama, which is why the Uchiha were not only deemed as possible culprits in the releasing of Kurama on the night of Naruto's birth, but also why the involving of the Uchiha in the battle back against Kurama would have been such a tactical advantage for Konoha if they had allowed for it to happen. Now, that ability to battle back against Kurama and his controller, Obito, most likely would have lied with Fugaku, who is at least within the confines of the anime, a Mangekyo Sharingan wielder, and therefore it's kind of loosely implied that in order to control eight-tailed beast, you need a Mangekyo Sharingan. And therefore, is Madara able to control Kurama because he's stronger than Kurama, or because he has a Mangekyo Sharingan? Well, it's probably a little column A and a little column B. See, yes, obviously Madara's Mangekyo Sharingan allows for him to use Genjutsu of a high enough level that he can control Kurama. But also Naruto, just using his Sage mode, was strong enough to defeat half of Kurama. And the combined forces of Kushina and Minato were able to defeat Kurama twice. Once before Minato was even Hokage, when he had to battle against Kurama inside of Kushina, and the other time being on the night of Naruto's birth. And thus, all in all, I believe it's relatively safe for us to assume that EMS Madara is stronger than Kurama, which is a good jumping off point for figuring out how strong he was while he was alive, but doesn't necessarily answer the question of how strong were the combined forces of Kurama and Madara heading into their final battle against Hashirama. See, because here's the thing, there's kind of some conflicting facts surrounding the idea of how powerful Madara was when he was alive. See, the logical conclusion to come to when talking about the final battle between Hashirama and Madara is that Hashirama is way stronger than Madara. Well, yes, at the end of the battle, we see that Tobirama is present by Hashirama's side. However, in the vast majority of the depictions of that final battle between Hashirama and Madara are really our only two combatants, especially when it comes down to the highest level moments of the fight, like Hashirama using his true 1,000 armed Guanyin Bodhidharma versus Madara's majestic attire Susanoo on Kurama. Now, in this moment, Hashirama's just using his strength. He's using his wood release, his ridiculous life force, and his Sage mode. However, in this moment, Madara, while he is cladding Kurama in his Susanoo, is also leveraging the power of the tailed beast that represents more than 50% of all of the chakra that goes into the 10 tails. And yet Hashirama still comes out victorious. And thus, if we assume that Madara and Kurama are even close to each other in terms of power, it paints a pretty big delta between Hashirama and Madara's powers at their respective peaks. See, because if we assume, let's say, that Madara and Kurama were equally powerful as each other heading into this battle against Hashirama, and Hashirama defeats both of them on his own, then that means that Hashirama at that moment in time is 2 times more powerful than Madara. Now, this is probably a stretch because Indra and Ashura reincarnations are meant to be somewhat equal to each other in terms of power, though it has seemingly been established time and time again that the Ashura reincarnation is always stronger. And this inference about the difference between Hashirama and Madara's power can be extended to the Fourth Great Shinobi World War. See, because Hashirama, who's not brought back in a perfected Edo Tensei body, and rather, like all of the other Kages, brought back as he died, which presumably happened somewhere between his late 50s and mid 60s after he exhausted all of his chakra from over-regenerating his body over the course of hundreds, if not thousands of fights. I mean, that's all theory. None of that is actually corroborated by the manga or the anime. But anyways, Hashirama, who's brought back just in the regular old Edo Tensei fashion, battles it out against Madara in the 4th Great Shinobi World War. And for all intents and purposes, this iteration of Madara should be able to defeat Hashirama. He's brought back in the prime of his life in a perfected body with access to both his Rinnegan and his EMS. Not to mention that he's also had Hashirama's cells grafted onto him, which would increase his overall chakra levels and his regeneration factor. But Nick, you say he's an Edo Tensei reincarnation. He already has infinitely refilling chakra and regeneration. Hashirama's cells don't really mean anything until he gets Sage Mode. And in a way, yes, you're right. Having Hashirama's cells grafted onto him just effectively gives him access to all the things that Edo Tensei already gave him access to. However, that's another reason that this battle afforded a massive amount of opportunity to Madara to win. See, because when it comes down to it, the fact that Hashirama and Madara were battling in Edo Tensei forms kind of negates any and all advantage that Hashirama had over Madara in terms of strength. Hashirama's entire gambit his entire life was the fact that he had nearly limitless chakra and a crazy regeneration factor, on account of the fact that he was the inheritor of Hagoromo's life force through Asura. But now, because Madara was also an Edo Tensei reincarnation with Hashirama cells, he effectively gained all of the hacks that Hashirama had. And on top of that, he also got his Intra's reincarnation aspects back. And yet, even with all of that swung to Madara's side, Hashirama still comes out victorious in their 4th Great Shinobi World War battle. So clearly, this corroborates the delta in strength between Hashirama and Madara, right? Well, no, unfortunately. See, because in chapter 657, after Madara has undergone Rinne Rebirth, Hashirama looks at this new, technically blind version of Madara and says, oh no, he's approaching his old strength. Which means that everything we saw from Madara up until his reincarnation using Rinne Rebirth technically wasn't as powerful as he was while he was alive. Now, does that make any sense? No, it doesn't. How could this iteration of Madara, who now had access to all of the abilities of the Rinnegan, possibly be weaker than a version of Madara that didn't? And yet, who am I to doubt Hashirama of all people when talking about Madara's strength? So that means literally everything that we see over the course of the 4th Great Shinobi World War until Madara undergoes Rinne Rebirth are feats that he should have been able to pull off while alive. Now, obviously, he wasn't able to do things like pull meteors out of orbit or absorb ninjutsu, because those are abilities that are inherently tied to the Rinnegan, something that he does not have for the consideration of this fight. But that means from a sheer AP, durability, and speed perspective, nothing that Madara did up until he is reborn using Rinne Rebirth falls out of the purview of things that he could do while alive. So could he have killed all 5 of the current Kage in his alive body just using his EMS? Probably. It wouldn't have involved using wood release, but that being said, he doesn't kill them until he busts out his perfect Susanoo, which is something he has access to with his EMS. This also means that KCM 1 and 2 modes Naruto do not compare to him in strength, and that he was league stronger than EMS Sasuke, who he, immediately after undergoing Rinne Rebirth, says is nowhere near him in terms of strength. And mind you, he was saying that with no eyeballs. And while we're not taking into account some of his jutsus, like him pulling 2 meteors out of the sky and smashing them on the Shinobi Alliance, it stands to reason that if that came from a weaker version of Madara than Madara was when he was alive, that level of destruction was still something he was capable of doing while just being an EMS wielder. And considering the fact that the impact of those 2 meteors was literally felt in the land of lightning, countries away when they landed, and the size of those meteors has been measured to somewhere in the region of 12 to 24 kilometers wide, roughly the size of the Chicxulub Collider, you know, the one that killed all of the dinosaurs, it stands to reason that if his AP is somewhat comparable to the one that he had while he was alive, that we were talking about in a highball sense a multi-continent level threat, and in a lowball sense a large country level threat. I mean, after all, Madara was still in his Edo Tensei form, he was actively said to rival the Bijou in strength, which should include, for the sake of our conversation, a 100% Kurama, which is once again corroborated the fact that sheer minutes after being brought with Rinne Rebirth and getting 1 Rinnegan, he's able to pull all of the Bijou into the Ghetto statue. So with all of this considered, the absolute lowest we could scale Madara's AP while he was alive is large country level. However, with the consideration around his perfected humanoid Susanoo that we've seen effortlessly slice mountains in half, it's probably somewhere closer to multi-continent level. And considering the fact that in his Edo Tensei form, he was able to dodge lightning cloak-based attacks from the 4th Raikage A, it's safe to assume that his speed is somewhere in the region of relativistic. So with all that considered, things look pretty bad for Kisame. Right? Well, not as bad as you actually might think. See, the crux of this entire argument is that between Madara and Kisame, there is one connective force. And that connective force is Might Guy. Yeah, both Kisame and Madara fought the same person. However, that same person underwent 2 very different forms to fight them. See, there is some who would immediately make the argument that that connective force, Might Guy, proves that any and all iterations of Madara are stronger than any and all iterations of Kisame. I mean, after all, Might Guy was in his 8th gate when he was battling against Madara. However, he was in his 7th gate while battling against Kisame. And not only was he in his 7th gate while battling against Kisame, he was in his 7th gate while battling against a Kisame without Samehada. But when Might Guy used his 8th gate to fight against Madara, he was battling against Jubidara with a Rinnegan and access to Hashirama's Sage Mode. So yeah, the Might Guy that Madara was fighting against was stronger than the Might Guy that Kisame fought against, but that version of Madara was also much stronger than the version of Madara that Kisame is gonna have to battle against. And thus you can start to see how some arguments could happen here. Kisame, without access to his ultimate tool, Samehada, took Might Guy to 7 gates, while Madara, with access to way more tools than the Madara we're talking about, took Might Guy to only 1 gate further. So how powerful is Kisame? Well, we've seen Kisame in a fair amount of rather impressive fights. We know that Kisame was able to defeat Roshi, the perfect Jinchuriki of Son Goku, who for all intents and purposes probably should have had a massive advantage in battle against Kisame on account of the fact that he had access to lava release. We then saw a clone of Kisame that only had access to 30% of his chakra push Might Guy to open the 6th gate. And then after it was revealed that Kisame had been hiding inside of Samehada to get information about the 2 remaining Jinchuriki, Might Guy and Kisame had their final battle. A battle where not only did Might Guy have to open up to the 7th gate, but also a battle that Kisame was kind of at a disadvantage in on account of the fact that Might Guy is the one guy in the entire universe who can punch the air so hard it turns into physical chakra-like constructs. The only thing that Kisame would be unable to absorb. This is a guy who almost drains the entirety of Gyuki's chakra, who Gyuki told Killer Bee to turn into his tailed beast transformation because of the level of threat he posed, and a guy who beat down Killer Bee with relative ease. And mind you, we haven't even talked about the fact that he's able to fuse with Samehada, which is where he gets his moniker of a tailed beast without a tail. And therefore, while usually he has to drain the chakra of somebody else through the medium of Samehada, usually by cutting them or banging into their chakra constructs with his sword, by fusing with Samehada, not only does he pick up on the passive ability to absorb other people's chakra, but he also sees massive boosts to his speed and strength. And therefore, on account of the fact that weaker iterations of the Kisame we're currently talking about are constantly shown as being stronger than Killer Bee, a perfect Jinchuriki of what is objectively the 2nd strongest tailed beast in the world, but also a weaker iteration of the Kisame than we're talking about right now, forced Might Guy to open up to his 7th gate. There's really no reason for us to assume that Kisame's AP is anything lower than country level. I mean, if Kisame is stronger than a perfect Jinchuriki who can undergo a Jinchuriki transformation and therefore use a tailed beast ball, especially a tailed beast ball on the level that we know that Gyuki is able to use tailed beast balls on account of the fact that we know Gyuki's tailed beast balls can counter tailed beast balls from the 10 tails, then yeah, his ability to not only injure Might Guy and Killer Bee, but also claim victory over them proves that his AP falls very comfortably in a low ball range to country level and in a high ball range to large country level, putting him at the lower end of that estimation we had for Madara. Not to mention on account of the fact that he was able to keep up with and dodge attacks from both a 6th and 7th gate guy and a version 2 transformed Killer Bee, especially when he's in water. The safest estimation of his speed is somewhere around relativistic and possibly a little bit faster if he's in water. So with all of that considered, who wins in this fight? Well, I'd be lying to you if I said that Kisame doesn't have a good kit to battle against somebody like Madara. Well, yes, Madara is known as a chakra monster who's able to battle with his Mangekyo Sharingan activated for 24 hours straight. We've seen relatively constantly that if Kisame is able to seep chakra from his opponent, he's not only able to drain them of chakra relatively quickly, as he was able to drain Gyuki of almost all of his chakra to the point where he couldn't intervene in Killer Bee's legs about to be cut off in just a few minutes, then it stands to reason that given the right set of circumstances that Kisame would be able to drain almost all of the chakra from Madara. I mean, Madara was talked about while he was in his Edo Tensei transformation as being as strong as the Biju, and therefore there is the possibility that maybe he has more chakra than Gyuki. But still, there's seemingly no ceiling on how much chakra Kisame and Samehada are able to consume. And as he himself is talked about a tailed beast in his own right, there are definitely scenarios where Kisame is able to drain Madara of all of his chakra, and boom, that's a win state. However, unfortunately for Kisame, that's kind of the only win state. See, yes, if hypothetically Kisame and Samehada were able to leak chakra from something like Madara Susanoo, which is after all just a gigantic chakra construct, then there is a fair amount of possibility that over the course of their fight, Kisame could eat away at Madara's chakra to the point where some of the high-level jutsu that we see from Madara, like his Susanoo or his ridiculous fireballs, would become borderline unusable for him. However, we're talking about a guy in Kisame who not only identifies Itachi as being stronger than him, but also Jiraiya. And don't get it twisted, those are two crazy high-level threats. However, Itachi, regardless of how heavily you weigh things like Amaterasu or Tsukiyomi, never comes even relatively close to the level of destruction that an alive EMS Madara was able to pull off. In short, yes, there's a hypothetical scenario where for some reason Madara pops to Susanoo all but instantaneously in a battle against Kisame. And yeah, maybe, if you want to try and say that their APs are closer to each other than I made it seem, there's a possibility that either a combined Kisame Samehada shark monster thing could either dodge the attacks from Madara Susanoo and begin leeching away at the chakra on account of the fact that he just kind of externalizes all the chakra in his body by creating a Susanoo, or Kisame, without fusing with Samehada, is able to block an incoming attack from one of Madara Susanoo and begin leeching chakra that way. Why would Kisame, who identifies Itachi as his superior, even gamble in a fight against somebody like Madara?
Oh, but Itachi has access to Tsukiyomi, and Kisame knows that, and therefore he knows before the battle would even begin, he'd been put into a genjutsu he can't break out of.
And while yes, I will admit that Madara isn't often identified as a genjutsu expert, he does have genjutsu powerful enough to control Kurama. And while yeah, Kisame is called the tailless tailed beast, that doesn't mean that he's anywhere even comparable to the 9 tails. But there is also the caveat that the connection of chakra flow between Samehada and Kisame would allow for Samehada to break Kisame out of genjutsu, and therefore genjutsu is kind of a null and void point when it comes to talking about advantages in this battle. Now, it is a point you have to bring up when talking about a hypothetical battle between Kisame and Itachi because of how quickly Tsukiyomi happens. But even without the consideration of genjutsu, we've seen two very ridiculously impressive feats of water release in the Naruto universe. And those two feats are Kisame covering an entire battlefield in a water dome that he can control in order to drown his foes like Killer Bee, and the entirety of the Shinobi Alliance working together to try and nullify the fire release of Madara. Now I get it, Kisame defeated Roshi, a lava release user, in a fight, but Madara is one of, if not the most adept flame release user in all of Naruto. The kind of dude who 5 villages worth of water release users need to work together to nullify the flame release of. And therefore, well yes, Kisame could pop his water dome and try and drown Madara. Not only could Madara just turn into his perfect Susanoo form and literally fly out of the water, but also pretty much any and all water release that Kisame tried to use in a battle against Madara would be instantly nullified. So yes, in a long battle of attrition, could Kisame possibly leak away all of Madara's chakra and gain himself a victory? I guess. But we're talking about the Uchiha with maybe the most chakra in the history of all Uchihas. And Kisame's already identified himself as weaker than the Uchiha with maybe the least chakra out of all of the Uchihas in history. Even in an ideal scenario where Kisame is able to start feeding off Madara's chakra, it's going to take a while to do any meaningful damage to his chakra reserves. And over the course of that time, the difference in AP between Kisame and Madara will become astoundingly apparent. Essentially, there's nothing that Kisame can do that could kill an EMS Madara. And while their speeds are relatively equal, the difference in their AP and therefore their durability is too glaring to ignore. There are no water release jutsus or swings of Samehada that allow for Kisame to break through even the smallest iterations of Madara Susanoo's. After all, mind you, Madara Susanoo ribcage was able to repel a big ball Rasengan from a KCM1 Naruto. It took the combined forces of both Tsunade and the 4th Raikage's lightning lariat to crack through it. And we're not even talking about his perfected Susanoo. We're talking about his ribcage. So can Kisame beat EMS Madara in a fight? No. No, he can't. If they fight 10 times, Kisame may win 1 time if things go horrifically well for him. But outside of that, unfortunately, Madara's chakra reserves are just too large, and the difference in their AP too glaring. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. In this hypothetical battle, who do you think comes out with a victory? Let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to pack all of this